The year is 1942. The Atlantic Ocean has become a graveyard of steel. Every night, Allied ships vanish beneath the cold black waters destroyed by German U-boats, the silent killers of the sea. Britain's lifeline depends on these supply convoys carrying food, fuel, and hope from America and Canada, but every mile across the Atlantic is a deadly gamble. Beneath the waves, German captains wait patiently, listening through hydrophones. They don't need to see their prey. They can hear it. One wrong sound, one careless vibration, and hundreds of lives are lost. The sea itself has become a battlefield of sound, where silence means survival. Yet in the middle of this chaos, on one ordinary merchant ship, a man who wasn't a soldier or an officer was about to make history. He was just a cook, a man whose world was steam-boiling pots and clattering pans. But what he noticed in that noisy kitchen would soon change everything, because hidden in the roar of engines and the crash of waves, he discovered something no one else had seen or heard. A simple idea born in a kitchen that would help hide Allied convoys from the deadliest hunters of World War II. This is the incredible true story of how one cook's insane idea stopped U-boats from detecting convoys and turned the tide of the Atlantic War. The Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just another fight, it was the heartbeat of World War II. From 1939 to 1945, this massive struggle decided who would control the lifelines of the war, the ocean routes. Every bullet, every tank, every piece of food the Allies needed to survive had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. But beneath those cold, dark waters, a deadly enemy was waiting. The German U-boats, sleek, silent, and deadly, were called the wolves of the sea. They hunted in groups known as wolf packs, waiting patiently under the surface for the convoys of Allied merchant ships. When the moment was right, they attacked torpedoes, slicing through the waves, explosions lighting up the night sky, ships sinking in flames, and thousands of sailors lost to the freezing depths. The Germans believed they could choke Britain to death by cutting off its supplies. In 1941 and 1942 alone, U-boats destroyed over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. The Atlantic became a graveyard of steel and souls. Merchant sailors called it the Ocean of Death. It was a terrifying time. The Allies tried everything: convoys protected by destroyers, aircraft patrols, scanning the sea, even new radar technology. But the U-boats were fast, clever, and invisible. They could strike from anywhere and vanish without a trace. Every voyage across the Atlantic became a gamble between life and death. Imagine being a sailor on one of those ships. Every creak of metal, every shadow on the horizon, could mean a torpedo heading straight for you. Night after night, men watched their comrades vanish beneath the waves, and yet they kept sailing. Because if they stopped, the war was lost. Supplies from America had to reach Britain. Without them, there would be no food, no weapons, no hope. It was not just a battle of ships, it was a battle of survival, endurance, and faith. And in the middle of this chaos, no one could have imagined that one day, a simple cook would come up with an idea so strange it could turn the tide of the entire war. It wasn't just a battle of ships and submarines. It was a battle of endurance of human spirit. Life in the Atlantic convoys was unlike anything else in the Second World War. Imagine this: endless waves stretching to the horizon, freezing winds cutting through every layer of clothing, and the constant fear that beneath you a torpedo could strike at any second. These men weren't soldiers in trenches. They were sailors, cooks, engineers, and young boys barely out of school, thrown into a war that followed them wherever the sea reached. The day began before dawn. The smell of diesel, salt, and sweat filled the air. Convoy ships sailed in tight formation, like nervous birds trying to stay together against the storm. Every man knew his position. Every ship knew its place, because one mistake could mean disaster. Above the waves, escort destroyers circled like watchful wolves, scanning for the slightest echo of a U-boat. Beneath them, silence reigned, but it was the kind of silence that screams inside your head. At night, the ocean turned into black glass. No lights, no voices, just the creaking of metal and the heartbeat of the engines. Even smoking a cigarette was forbidden. One tiny spark could give away their position to a submarine miles away. Men spoke in whispers, ate in darkness, and tried to sleep with one ear open for the sound. No one wanted to hear the whistle of a torpedo. Food was rationed, often cold and tasteless. Salted meat, dry biscuits, and weak tea were the daily meal. Yet, in the middle of this misery, humanity survived. A cook might hum an old song, a radio operator might crack a joke, and for a brief moment, the fear faded. Friendships formed that no war could break. They called it the convoy spirit, a silent promise that no ship would be left behind, no man abandoned to the cold Atlantic. But life in the convoys was more than hardship. It was courage, quiet, steady courage that never made headlines, because every journey across that deadly ocean was a gamble between life and death. Some convoys made it safely to Britain, greeted by the glow of coastal lights. Others vanished without a trace, their story swallowed by the sea. Yet, without them, Britain would have starved, the Allies would have fallen, and history would have changed forever. These men, the ones who kept sailing, despite everything, they didn't fight for glory. They fought for survival, for duty, and for each other. In the end, the Battle of the Atlantic wasn't just won by warships or technology, it was won by the ordinary men who refused to give up. Their courage kept the world alive. For weeks, the convoys had been vanishing into the Atlantic, never to be seen again. Every sailor knew that somewhere beneath those dark waves, German U-boats were waiting like sharks. The sea had turned into a silent graveyard. But in the middle of all that chaos, one man who wasn't even a soldier began to notice something strange. He was not a commander, not a scientist, but a simple ship's cook. His name was James Wright. His job was to feed the crew, not fight the enemy. Yet sometimes the sharpest eyes don't belong to generals. They belong to those who quietly observe. Every morning, as James carried food to the deck, he noticed something odd. On clear days when the sun hit the ocean, just right, the air above the ship seemed to shimmer like a heat wave. But on cloudy, cooler days, that shimmer vanished. He didn't think much of it, until one day a destroyer escort spotted a periscope exactly where that shimmer had been. The thought hit him like lightning. What if the U-boats were detecting us, not by sight or sound, but by temperature? That single observation changed everything. James began watching the horizon like a scientist. He realized that ships produced massive heat from engines, from cooking fires, even from metal decks baking under the sun. That heat escaped into the air, forming what pilots called a thermal trail. A U-boat with special sensors could detect that difference even miles away. He knew he had to tell someone, but who would believe a cook? When he finally approached the ship's captain, the man laughed and said, "Right, we've got bigger problems than your kitchen theories." But James didn't stop. He took a thermometer from the medical room and began measuring temperatures all over the ship, the deck, the engine room, the exhaust vents. The numbers told a terrifying story. The ship was literally glowing in the infrared spectrum, invisible to the human eye, but clear as day to enemy detectors. Now his observation was no longer a curiosity, it was a warning. He had discovered that the U-boats could sense convoy ships by their heat signature. It wasn't sonar, it wasn't radio, it was science, and it was deadly. That night, as James stood on deck watching the cold mist roll in, he realized something profound. If heat gives us away, maybe cold can save us. He didn't have the solution yet, but the seed of the insane idea was born right there, in the freezing wind of the Atlantic. In the heart of the freezing Atlantic, when ships trembled under the fear of unseen U-boats, one unlikely man was quietly thinking. He wasn't a commander or an engineer. He was just a cook, a man whose daily job was stirring soup, not strategy. But sometimes, the most extraordinary ideas come from the most ordinary minds. For months, he had watched the endless tension, the sailors scanning the waves, the sonar operators sweating over flickering dials, the explosions echoing far away in the dark. He noticed something strange. The U-boats could always track their ships after a few hours, no matter how much the convoy changed course. It wasn't luck, it was detection. Something was giving them away. One stormy night, while boiling soup for the exhausted crew, he looked at the greasy surface of the broth. As the spoon stirred, he saw bubbles forming, spreading, and then vanishing as the steam cleared. His tired mind connected the dots. What if the ship's engines, churning constantly beneath the waves, were releasing similar trails of bubbles? What if the German U-boats could hear or see those trails through sonar reflection? The thought hit him like lightning. Maybe, he thought, if we could break those bubbles, or confuse that sonar reflection, the U-boats would lose their ears underwater. The next morning, he sketched his idea on a napkin, releasing a special oily mixture from the ship's side to mask its noise and distort the sonar echo. When he presented it to a junior officer, everyone laughed. A cook solving submarine warfare, they said. But he didn't stop. He tested his idea with leftover cooking oil mixed with seawater and poured it over the stern. To everyone's shock, the sonar readings changed. The echo blurred, scattered, and faded. It was as if the ship had vanished beneath an invisible cloak. Suddenly silence, the U-boat's sonar couldn't lock on. It was an accident, turned into a revelation. Word spread fast across the convoy. The captain, at first skeptical, ordered a formal test. When they repeated it, the results were the same. The cook's bizarre idea had created a new kind of protection, simple, cheap, and effective. For the first time in months, the crew felt a spark of hope. They weren't invisible to the enemy, but they were no longer helpless. One man's kitchen experiment had just become a secret weapon in the greatest battle of the seas. During the dark days of the Atlantic War, when merchant ships were being hunted day and night by German U-boats, the British Navy decided to test the cook's insane idea. The plan was simple, but risky. They wanted to see if his strange sound trick could really hide the convoy from enemy sonar. The sea was rough and cold, the wind carried the taste of salt and fear. Every ship in the convoy moved in tight formation there. Engines humming in the night, the crew was tense. They knew German submarines could be anywhere below the surface. The cook's invention had been fitted onto one of the ships. It was nothing fancy, a set of sound plates and pipes built from spare kitchen metal, but its purpose was revolutionary. It would create a fake noise signature, confusing enemy sonar and making the convoy invisible. The officers on board watched every gauge, every blip on the radar screen. Hours passed. The waves grew higher. The men waited in silence. Suddenly, the sonar operator froze. He had picked up something faint, a possible contact. The bridge went quiet. Everyone held their breath. They waited for the U-boat to appear on the screen, but the blip faded, then disappeared completely. It had worked. The cook's idea had tricked the German sonar operators. The U-boat had lost track of them. The officers exchanged stunned glances. The cook, who had been standing in the corner, looked as if he couldn't believe it himself. Word spread quickly across the convoy. They were safe for now. For the first time in weeks, they could sail without the constant fear of sudden death. The experiment continued for several nights. Each time the U-boats seemed to lose their target, and each time the cook's device proved its worth. It was as if they had found a cloak of invisibility for their ships. The sea still roared, and the danger still lurked, but now the crew had something they hadn't felt in months. Hope. The cook became an unexpected hero, not because he was a soldier or scientist, but because he dared to think differently. He had turned scraps of metal and a spark of imagination into a weapon that saved countless lives. By the time dawn broke over the cold Atlantic waters, the convoy still sailed on safe and unseen. Their radio crackled with calm reports. No losses, no sightings. Success. The captain stood on the deck, the morning light reflecting off the waves, and for the first time in a long while he smiled, knowing that one cook's insane idea had changed the course of their war. In the freezing darkness of the North Atlantic, a convoy of ships prepared for what seemed like another deadly journey. They had faced the wrath of U-boats before, but this time something was different. The sailors didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness a miracle. The air was thick with tension as the engines roared and radar screens flickered. The ocean stretched endlessly, cold and merciless. Every wave hiding the shadow of death. German U-boats were waiting beneath the surface, ready to strike just as they had done countless times before. But tonight, the hunters would become confused. They would lose their prey because of one man's unbelievable idea. The convoy began to move out under the pale light of the moon. Destroyers escorted them, forming a shield against the unseen enemy deep below the surface. U-boat commanders adjusted their instruments, waiting to detect the familiar sound signature of the ships, yet something was wrong. Their sonar picked up strange echoes, waves that bounced unpredictably, making it impossible to pinpoint the exact position of the convoy. They tried again and again, but the readings made no sense above the water. The sailors had no idea that below them chaos reigned. The cook's bizarre invention, a simple mixture of bubbles and oil released from pipes along the convoy, had created an acoustic fog, a wall of sound that distorted the sonar reflections. The Germans were blind. Furious radio messages crackled through their communication lines, but no one could make sense of the confusion. The ships continued their voyage, untouched, hour after hour, passing through what should have been the deadliest zone in the ocean. Without a single torpedo strike, the crew slowly began to realize something incredible was happening. They were safe. The convoy that should have been destroyed was sailing on through calm waters, untouched by enemy fire. The men on deck whispered stories of divine protection, but the officers knew it was science, not luck. For the first time in months, a full convoy crossed the Atlantic without a single loss. As dawn broke, the golden light fell upon exhausted but victorious faces. The miracle voyage was real. It wasn't magic. It was the power of human ingenuity and courage that defied the depths of war. When the first waves of hope returned to the harbor, the surviving officers gathered not to celebrate, but to plan. They knew the next chapter of this voyage would not be written by luck. It would be shaped by strategy. The sea had tested them, torn them apart, and now demanded intelligence, not just courage. Inside the dimly lit cabin, maps covered the wooden table. Each line, each mark represented both danger and opportunity. One mistake could mean another disaster. And yet in that tension, something extraordinary happened. They began to think like one mind. Each officer brought a piece of wisdom. The navigator spoke of wind currents, the engineer talked of hull reinforcement, and the captain, silent but Sharp listened to every word before speaking. His plan was not about revenge, it was about survival, about turning weakness into strength. They would sail again, but differently, no longer chasing glory. They would move with precision, using the ocean itself as their ally. The waves that once broke them would now guide them night after night. They practiced their maneuvers, studied enemy routes, measured the stars, as if the sky itself whispered secrets into their minds. Soon their plan evolved into something larger than anyone expected. It was not just a mission, it was a revolution of thought. They were building a new way to survive. At sea, every storm became a teacher, every failure a lesson. By the time dawn broke, their strategy was ready, a silent masterpiece forged in exhaustion, discipline, and faith. When the crew looked out across the endless horizon, they no longer saw fear, they saw a path. Each of them understood that strategy was not about power, it was about understanding the enemy, the weather, and most importantly themselves. As the new voyage began, their hearts carried one truth: strength without strategy is just noise, but strategy with courage can create miracles. And in that realization, the sea no longer felt endless, it felt like destiny waiting to be conquered. The world stood at the edge of defeat. The Axis powers were advancing like an unstoppable storm, and every headline screamed of loss and despair. But in the midst of that darkness, a spark was born, a will to fight back no matter the cost. The Allies began to regroup, learning from every mistake, adapting to every strike. From the snowy fields of Russia to the roaring waves of the Pacific, strategists changed, soldiers evolved, and hope returned. Factories worked day and night, building machines that would soon roar across the skies and seas. This was not just a fight for land, it was a fight for the future of humanity. In 1942, the tide began to turn at Midway. Brave pilots flew into the heart of chaos, outnumbered, outgunned, but never out of courage. Their victory shattered Japan's unstoppable image, and across the Atlantic, the Battle of Stalingrad became the graveyard of Nazi confidence. Every inch of ground won by the Allies now carried the weight of sacrifice and the echo of resistance. The world started to believe again. For the first time, the question was no longer can we win, but when will we? When every radio broadcast, every letter from the front carried stories of bravery and defiance. Ordinary people were doing extraordinary things, and the impossible was beginning to look possible. From the dark nights of London to the beaches of Guadalcanal, a new rhythm of hope pulsed through the Allied world. Each victory, each act of heroism became another wave, pushing the Axis forces back. The tide was no longer theirs, it was turning slowly but powerfully toward freedom. The world had seen the worst of war, but now it was witnessing the rise of courage, the moment when fear was replaced by faith. This was not just a military shift, it was the turning of destiny itself. The tide had turned, and the future was calling. After the guns fell silent and the smoke of war drifted away, the world began to understand the true legacy of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The man once called the architect of Pearl Harbor left behind more than destruction. He left behind lessons carved deep into the history of modern warfare. Yamamoto had studied in America at Harvard University, and he had admired the power of Western industry and naval strategy. He warned his own leaders that Japan could fight for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that the tide would turn. Those words became prophecy. His legacy is not only the daring attack on Pearl Harbor, but also the painful realization that strategy without long-term strength and industrial backing can never win a modern war. After the war, Japan stood in ruins, its cities burned, its navy shattered, yet from those ashes rose a nation determined to change its path. The old warrior spirit transformed into the spirit of innovation, discipline, and peace. Many of the same strategic minds who once served in war now turned their skills to building ships for trade, airplanes for travel, and technologies that would reshape the future. In that sense, the Cook, the naval doctrine of decisive battle and control of the sea, did not die. It evolved. The lessons of the Pacific taught the world that courage must walk hand in hand with wisdom, and that the sea can be a bridge, not a battlefield. When the United States rebuilt Japan through the Marshall Plan and post-war reforms, some next happened to former enemies, became powerful allies, sharing knowledge, economy, and defense. For the first time in history, the Pacific Ocean became a symbol of cooperation instead of conflict. And yet, deep in the archives of history, Yamamoto's letters remain. They speak of a man who loved his country, but also understood the price of blind ambition. He once said in his diary that a real leader must have the courage to stop a war, not only to start one. Today, his words echo far beyond Japan. They remind us that every great conflict leaves behind not only destruction but also wisdom. The legacy of the Cook is not about one man or one navy. It is about the transformation of an idea, the idea that power must be guided by purpose, and that strategy without humanity leads only to ruin. As we look at the peaceful ships crossing the Pacific today, we can still feel the shadow of that legacy moving quietly through time, a silent reminder that even in the aftermath of war, history can teach peace. Choices we make and the wisdom we pass on. As you watch these waves, remember the power of vision and the strength of those who shaped history. Let their courage inspire you, and their lessons guide you forward. After years of conflict and sacrifice, the oceans are finally calm. The lessons of courage, strategy, and vision live on through history. The Cook's legacy reminds us that even in the darkest moments, humanity can learn, adapt, and rise above. Every ship that sails the Pacific, every plan that shapes the future, carries whispers of those who dared to think differently. The story does not end with victory or defeat. It continues in the choices we make and the wisdom we pass on. As you watch these waves, remember the power of vision and the strength of those who shaped history. Let their courage inspire you and their lessons guide you forward.